Okay, I'm on. Howdy out there. I'm James. Oh, howdy out there. I'll start again. I just got unmuted. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll believe you're hearing me. My wife and I are missionaries, church service missionaries at the BYU Family History Library on the BYU campus. Of course, we've been shut down since March. We are also much involved, even internationally, in the larger genealogical community. And I also, both of us serve on the board of directors of the Family History Guide, which I'm, oh, okay, can't see my webcam.
You're good.
Yeah, am I okay?
Yes.
Okay.
We can see your screen.
Oh, okay, so you didn't want to look at me, that's fine. I don't want to look at me either, so that's great. We also, at the BYU Family History Library, let me just mention this rather quickly. We have, of course, been all of the missionaries. We have over 140 missionaries that serve, and we are now going completely online and starting up a help desk, which will be available every day, all day long, with missionaries monitoring the help desk during the day on different shifts. We are also presenting classes, live classes during the week and on Sunday evenings, Sunday afternoons. And you can look at those on the BYU Family History Library website. Just put in BYU Family History Library and you'll go right to the website. And then you'll have schedules of all the classes. Also during the week, we have webinars and presentations, which also go on to the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel. Also, if you're interested, and I would suggest you should be, we also have a website which is very extensive and very structured and very educational and free from the Family History Guide. So all of those things are available online and free, and we can help you on both sides of that situation. We're going to talk today about getting the most from genealogical records. And let me just click here. One thing we need to learn is how to wring the last drop of information from our records. Unfortunately, the way that the records are presented to us online, we often are looking at the things that we're looking for. In other words, if I put in a name and a date and a place from one of my relatives or ancestors, and a record pops up, then I say, oh, great. And then there's some information that I was looking for, like a birth date or a marriage date or whatever. And then I say, that's it, great, wonderful. And I turn it into a source if I get to that point in my process, and attach it to my person in a family tree. For the purposes of this particular presentation, I'm going to be talking about the FamilySearch family tree and using that for the examples. And there's a number of reasons for that, which I'll kind of highlight as I go along. But what we need to do is look further at the records, because the records can contain a lot of information. And I'm going to cover a variety of different kinds of records and indicate the kinds of information that might be found on that record in addition to something you were specifically looking for, and also the types of records that you might look into to find more information, simply because now you have more connections made by the record you found in the first place. So that may not make a lot of sense now, but it will in a moment. If you're working on the FamilySearch family tree or the other major genealogical database family tree programs, such as Ancestry.com or MyHeritage.com or FindMyPast.com, these websites all have record hints, record matches, they call them different things, green leafs on Ancestry. So these particular things, and what I caution you is to avoid the record hint trap. In other words, thinking that that's the records, that's all there is. That's all I need to do is go in and click on the little blue icons and add those records, and I'm kind of through with my work. Well, that's a trap. The trap is that you're missing a lot of things. First of all, in none of these programs, well, with the exception of MyHeritage, which I am certain searches all their records, but even when you do get record hints and record matches, that does not mean there are not additional records which are available even on that website, on FamilySearch or one of the other websites that have not been found by the record matches. And that's particularly true on FamilySearch because only, well, less than half of the records on FamilySearch are indexed, which means that the record matches can't find them anyway, that you'd have to find them by looking in the catalog and looking at digital records directly. So this is kind of a trap, and there's a couple of things that you need to do when you get the records hints that to help you to avoid being in that trap. And that is, first of all, to carefully check each record hint before you add it into your person. Just because FamilySearch or one of the other programs found a match does not mean that it's actually your person. It may be somebody else. One of the most common ones I see in all of the programs is when we get back a few years in the history, back into the early 1800s and even into the 1700s. None of the programs do a very good job of matching. I can look for a person who lived in Virginia in the 1700s, and a record match or hint coming up will give me a whole list of people living in England, which doesn't help me a lot. So we need to make sure that we understand what we're looking for and understand what we are given when we get a record hint. Then look at the names, dates, and especially the places. The names and the dates may be exactly the same. It's not unusual to have people with common names, and by the way, most names are common, to have people born on with the same name on the same date. But it's less likely to have the same name and the same date and the same place, because the places are usually more unique than the names and dates. So make sure that you check those. Also make sure to add all the new information to your family tree as a source. Very commonly on the FamilySearch family tree, I will find a birth date or a marriage date or whatever that's completely out of, doesn't agree with anything that I know and all the records that I have. And so I'll look at the sources list attached to that person and find out that there's a birth record or a marriage record, a christening record or whatever. And the problem is whoever added that source record, that christening record or that birth record or marriage record, didn't bother to change the date that was entered into the main part of the program. What that does, of course, is it sort of proliferates bad information because other people coming in will copy that or use that for their information. And also it misleads any searching you might do on any of the programs, because if you have the wrong date with the person, you're not going to find the right person. It's just simple. And any subsequent record hints or record matches will basically not be helpful. So getting the correct information into the search fields, into the fields for the details of each individual is extremely important. Also, remember to edit your sources to show where you got the information. In most cases, if you add a record hint, it will put a source in, so it'll put the source. But you may want to add more information to that source than just what is added by that automatic process on the program. Okay, well, let's look at some of the records with a little more depth. If what you're seeing on the screen right now looks a little bit intimidating, it's because that particular record is back. It's actually in oh, let's see. I don't remember what I copied it from. Yes, it's not in English, so you don't have to worry too much about it unless you want to get into that particular one. But that's the kind of thing that you're going to run into quite frequently when you get back far enough. Okay, my first example is from the 1850 US Census. And in this case, what I did was I simply looked up one of my ancestors one of my great-great-grandfathers, Sidney Tanner, who I have quite a few records for, so I wanted to use that as an example. But I want to use it as an example because what was surprising to me, because I hadn't focused on it really very well for quite a while, because I've been a while since I've worked through Sidney Tanner. That was an early person. Those were early people that I worked on. And I discovered that this 1850 US Census where he appeared with his family was from Utah Valley. And I didn't realize that he lived in Utah Valley. I knew that he had lived in San Bernardino, was sent there as a settler by Brigham Young. And then when the Utah War came, they moved back to Beaver, Utah, where they all lived until they were sent other places, like my great-grandfather, who was sent down to Arizona. So this 1850 census was interesting, and you can use the information that's with the record. When you bring up a record like this, there's going to be a little field at the bottom that says information. And if you click on that, you'll see all the information about where the source is and where it came from and where to go to get the original record, all of that information. So I would just suggest this is the information you need to add. It may not all be in this format. You may put parts of it in different parts, in different fields in the source records, but this is the information that you need to add to your source so that future researchers know exactly where to go and what it was that you were looking at. Okay, so let's take a look at the record a little closer. And this is the Sidney Tanner family. So we see Sidney Tanner and Julia Ann, his wife, and some children, 20, 16, 15, 14, 12, 3, and 1. Interesting things. If you look over at the right-hand side, you'll see that the place where they were born, and it was New York, Ohio, New York, Ohio, New York, Missouri, Illinois, and DES. That's an interesting one. So where would you think that those children were born, DES? The answer to that is that's when they were calling it Deseret, and so that's where they were born. Now, are all these children the children of Sidney Tanner and Julia Ann? Are all of these children who are these people? Who are all these people? Well, that's another story, but that's the kinds of questions that you need to ask rather than just simply, if you were coming to this cold first time, you've discovered this was your direct line ancestor, and copying it down and then making the assumption that these were the children. You would be wondering here because Julia Ann is 22 and the oldest child listed there, Alan, is 20. And I don't think that Julia Ann had a baby when she was 2 years old, and or when she was 4 years old, and or when she was 7 years old, and or when she was on down the list. So Julia and Albert are probably the only two children who are actually the children of Julia Ann. And so there's some more information that needs to be developed here. And that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we say we need to start getting all of the information out of the record. It is, there's a lot more information here than you might guess. And you might have a lot of questions that you didn't have answered easily. So now we look up at the same record, just a little page up on the same page, and you'll find a person by the name of Samuel Shepard. Well, it may take you a little while, But this person who shows up on Samuel Shepherd as Samuel Shepherd is the father of Julia Ann Shepherd. And you'll see, interestingly enough, that they have Julia listed as a child in this family at age 22, and she was also listed as the wife of Sidney Tanner. So you can go figure that out. This Sidney says she was born in Vermont. This Julia says she was born in Vermont. So now we have a bunch of different information that we need to deal with. But always check the entire census record where the town where they lived. And the reason for that, going beyond just the simple finding the record and attaching it to your source, feeling good about that, is to go use the information that you've been given to find more information. So now when you get here, you get into the next level of this, and you start going through the the other thing I should have pointed out is that Samuel Shepherd has a second wife. How do I know that? Because I knew the mother of Julia Ann Shepherd, and this Charity Shepherd is not her mother. And so that brings up another issue. It's easy for me, and it seems like as I talk through this that you're saying, oh yeah, well, he already knew all that kind of stuff. Well, if I hadn't known all that information, I would have had to look, because I would have eventually found Julia Ann Shepherd Tanner's mother's name, and it would be different than this lady. And so perhaps then that would say, well, maybe there was a second wife. And the question here is, which of the children are the children of Samuel Shepherd and Charity, if any of them, and which are the children of the other mother? Okay, so you're going to find some things on the census records, even just on this level, and all records. Sometimes there's going to be some very surprising information, things that you had no idea about. And this record also confirms the identity of several of Samuel Shepherd's children. You may get into a little bit of a situation here, because they have listed children who are basically, sounds like my wife's phone went off. The listed some children here that are also listed in their own families. So unlike the census records, where they listed only the people that were there present, here they've listed all the children, or they've listed some of the children and not all the children. And some they've double listed. So those are other kinds of things that you need to work through as you're working with it. As you read through, there were about 60 pages, 67 pages of the Utah County, or Utah Valley, Utah County census record, which from my perspective isn't really a whole lot. I'm used to going through many, many more pages than that. But it was interesting here because I came across Elizabeth Tanner at the same time. And the question here is, who was Elizabeth Tanner? Once again, you would need to do some research to find out. You do have some children listed here: Albert, Freeman, Joseph, David, and Sariah. And the question is, who are these children? Why is Elizabeth Tanner here named as an individual without a spouse? Lots of different questions here. Well, this turns out to be interesting because her name is Elizabeth Beswick Tanner, Sidney Tanner's stepmother. So this is actually the Tanner family, and these children here are either brothers and sisters of Sidney Tanner, or what do we call them, half brothers and sisters. As it turns out that Elizabeth Tanner was Sidney Tanner's father's third wife, not polygamist, third in succession. His two other wives died, and so this was his third wife. And he had children with all of them and ended up with a total of 23 children. So you can expand your family lines also by going, as I went through step by step on the parish, I also found Lafayette Shepherd, who was Julia Ann Shepherd Tanner's brother. Okay, I'm probably losing you with the relationships here, but the point being that as you go through the census records, those questions should come up because this is a relatively small community. It's a lot of different towns down here in Utah Valley, but it's a lot of people who, a lot of the information here is implies relationships, especially with names that are not as common as Smith and Jones and some Scandinavian names. But Lafayette Shepherd is obviously not a common name. And I might also mention that I might also mention that we've got all sorts of noises going on. I hope you can't hear much of that. We have Lafayette Shepherd was also listed as a child of Samuel Shepherd back a few screens. Yes, it does help to have a fairly good memory for all of these organizations as you work your way through, or it may start to get extremely complicated. But on the other hand, if you're keeping good records and you're taking the information and pulling all the information out that you have, and then when you come across this, begin doing more research and using more records. So one of the lessons that you should learn from looking at just even this one census record is that you should spend a considerable amount of time learning about the families and building your families source by source so that you can figure out all the different kinds of relationships that you're going to have. It's going to be very interesting. Another thing you'll see here is that in this Lafayette Shepherd family, there are children whose last name is Parrish. So that gives you another area of research that you might need to look at. Okay, so that was one kind of record. That was the census records, and you could spend a lot more time if you looked at various census records over periods of years to indicate exactly how much information that you would want to, that you can get out of the census records, more than just the names and family members and maybe some calculated dates. Now we're going to go to another set of records, and the idea here of the presentation is that we're going to just look at records, and not all of them are going to be about the same people. So I'm not trying to show how cumulatively you can build a family through looking at different records. That's a different topic here. What I want to emphasize is that when you find a record, don't stop with the record. Use the information that's in the record to both add additional information that you might not necessarily be looking for at the first glance, but also use those to suggest additional other records. So in this case, we're looking at a church record, and this church record's on Ancestry, and it is the membership of the church in the Church Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints back in the 1800s. Up to the 1900s. It's a huge database on Ancestry of members of the church. Okay, so what do we do here with Samuel Shepherd? If we look at that, we'll see that we learn his parents' names, David Shepherd and Didoma Hopkins. Okay, well, Didoma is kind of an unusual name, and it usually has been spelled in different ways. It's Didama and Didoma and all sorts of other ways. Nobody really knew how to spell that name back in the 1800s. So that is one lead that comes from this church record. He also has a birth date, and he has 2 alternate birth dates. He was either born on the 10th of November in 1788, or he was born in 1790, or he was born on 1792. The question that's going to be asked by most people is, well, which one's the correct birth date? Maybe nobody knows. Maybe all the sources, maybe he reported it, his birth date, differently when he was asked, depending on what he remembered. Or perhaps some of these are calculated birth dates from when he gave his age, and he gave his age as a different age every time he was asked. Thinking of people who were born back in the 1700s may or may not have been very literate, if at all, and may not even known a way to spell their name. In other words, they may not have known what their name was in the sense of the way that it was supposed to be spelled. So what you have to do here is use a little bit of liberal thing. But what's this going to help you do? Well, as you see this, you're going to realize that the Samuel Shepherd that you found, who was born in 1788, may be the same one that you found in 1790, and may be the same one you found in 1792. So this is kind of a flag that tells you you may have to expand your concept of when this person was born to make sure that you find all of the records that pertain to Samuel Shepherd. Additionally, when you look at this, you could say, well, maybe if I find something in 1789 or maybe another year off or two, that it might be the same person. So we're going to have to do a lot more specific research, simply because on this church record they had 3 different birth dates. Then they put in, to complicate things, they put in a birthplace. And he was either born in Bennington, Vermont, or he was born in Tinmouth, Rutland, Vermont. Okay, so are there 2 Samuel Shepherds? The answer to this is, what kind of record is this? This is a church record. Where did the information come from? The information came from Samuel Shepherd. Where did he say he was born? He eventually said he was born in 2 different places. How does that occur? Okay, so here's a good example of the kinds of things that can happen here. If you said, where are you from, to me, and you didn't say, where were you born specifically, which hospital were you born in? If you didn't ask that question and you just said where you were from, I would say, I'm from Arizona. And if I was being more specific, I'd say I'm from a small town in eastern Arizona. And the name of the town is St. John's, Arizona. Okay. And why would I say that? Because that's what I consider to be where I'm from. But what's real? I was born in Utah, but I wasn't in Utah. My mother was here when I was born. That's all. My life and my early life and everything I can remember, most everything I can remember, is Arizona. So when you ask somebody where they're from, instead of being specific, you're going to get different answers than depending on what you say. So the first one, when they asked the birth date, when they asked about a birthplace, they may have said, where are you from? And they said, well, I'm from Bennington. And if they ask, where were you actually born? He may have said Tinmouth, Rutland, or whatever. So those are the kinds of things that we need to be aware of and when we're trying to get record. But there is only one death date, and the death place is one death place. Okay, so we do have kind of an anchor here that shows us where we can start looking. And if you look at the record on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a tremendous amount of more information about this person. So this is kind of the important thing. And further, if you look at all that information that's there, then you can follow the trail. So you can start out there in Rutland, Vermont, and you can track this family across the country at various stopping places until they get to San Bernardino, California, where he dies. So you have an interesting challenge. Now, what does the map show you, and what does this following the trail show you? It shows you that there are different places along this map that on this route connection that may have records. And so just knowing from that one church record that there were various places where this person lived in their life already gives you access to more records that than you may not have found previously. And also, if you haven't done research for the records that he had in Utah Valley, you would never know that he was in the 1850 census in Utah Valley. And he's not in Utah Valley University either. That's just what Google came up with as a waypoint on the map. He was long dead before UVU ever became a university. Okay, so we can look for records along that whole thing. Here's a way to follow the trail. So now I'm going to, in this case, I used that David Shepherd, who is the father of Samuel Shepherd, and who was the father of Julia Ann Shepherd, who was my great-great-grandmother. So these people are my great-great-grandparents, back great generations. And so what we have here is a probate record. Now, probate records are generated if they own, depending. Today, probate records have a little bit less meaning than they did many years ago. Back many years ago, almost every person who died had to be probated because there was no other way to transfer the ownership of their property. And for another basic reason is that there were taxes on everything. So if you, in your estate, if you had even a packet of pins or a bridle or a saddle for a horse, that could be included in the value of your property and may have been taxed. So everybody ended up getting a probate. Some of them are very short, some of them are very long. But on this probate record, if we go back to where these people were from, in Rutland County, actually, is where they actually came from, then we find David Shepherd and his estate that was probated beginning in December of 1821. And then it went to go through in the value of his estate and the claims against the estate. Actually, it turns out that David Shepherd's didn't have anything by the time all of the claims were made to his estate. He never got a penny out of it. And so here's Diadema Shepherd ex her mark. And you can see, and then listed down there is Samuel, S-A-M-U-L Shepherd. So now you can start to see the connections and you can begin to get more information. But you're going to learn a lot of information about this, and there's guardians and there's lots of other records in here. It says, David Shepherd Minor above age 14 chose Nathan Parsons guardian. So David Shepherd was made the guardian of Nathan guardian. Back in those days when the father died with minor children, then anything that was inherited by the minor children was put into a guardianship, and somebody had to be appointed the guardian, and there are more records. So everything in this particular probate basically leads us to start looking for other records. And all of the different information that's in here implies that there are other things that we need to know about before we finish. Okay, so let's look at another probate record, and this one is a real one. This is what the real probate record looks like. It's actually not white on black. It's reversed, so you can even see the lettering, because if you go black on white, it's almost impossible to read. So that's how it's been preserved. And this one is in Hopkinton, Rhode Island. And this is the probate for Francis Tanner. Now, Francis Tanner goes back 6 or 7 generations from me, and it's my direct line Tanner ancestor. And my family came ultimately from, the Tanner family ultimately came from Rhode Island, that Tanner family. There's lots of other Tanner families that aren't related, but this Tanner family did come from Rhode Island. Now, what are the kinds of things that you see here? Unfortunately, we have, through someone's generous work, a transcription of what that previous document said. And so this is the transcription of that probate record, the will of Francis Tanner. First, it names his children. So he goes through and names all of his children. And then he goes through and lists where his property is located. And then he goes to and names his brothers. So he says he bought land from my brother Benjamin Tanner and so forth. And then he talks about my brother Nathan Tanner and where he lives, and all of that kind of information helps to build the family. So at the end of this will, we knew that Francis Tanner had 2 brothers, Nathan and Benjamin. And we also knew, because of some other records, we could discover who his mother was. And then we have names of neighbors. And the neighbors here is an interesting name from the neighbors is Sheldons. And the Sheldons end up being an interesting family. And there's more research that can be done. And eventually one of the Sheldons' descendants marries a Tanner. So I'm related to the Sheldons, and they become my relatives also, even though they're neighbors. So all of that becomes interesting because of the cross references. But if you don't spend the time and you don't look at every single fact until you understand exactly what it's saying and figure out exactly who these people are, then it becomes, just another document, and you could start claiming, well, I don't know any of that stuff. And the answer is it's all there in the probate record if you just spend the time to search through every document and read everything and understand what everything says. That's going to be a challenge. I'm granted, I agree that it could be very difficult, and it could be something that you would never that you couldn't imagine taking that much time, but that's really what we're talking about when we talk about doing genealogical research, is milking these documents or wringing out every last drop of the information. Now, down here at the bottom and other places, there's a mention of a place called Mumford Mill, and there's also Mumford's Mill River, and its exact location of by this we know that there was the location of where this particular Tanner family's farm was. Now, why is that important? Well, because there happened to be a lot of people named Tanner in Rhode Island at this time, and we can't really assume that they're all related, because Tanner is a very common name. It's an occupational name, and it's people named Tanner come from all over England. So they may or may not ultimately be. I don't think there was one original Tanner in England. It was always an occupational name. Even going back into the Bible, by the way, it was an occupational name. So if you know that reference, where Peter goes to visit the Tanner. Okay. But the mystery here is Mumford's Mill. Doing a quick search, there doesn't appear to be any place in Rhode Island named Mumford's Mill. And that happens to be correct. There doesn't happen to be any place. There's an online website called the Board on Geographic Names from the in the 18th on the United States government back in the 70s began geographic names from all the maps and accumulating this huge database of names, which is now online and searchable for the whole world, but primarily here in the United States. And so you can look up, and if it's ever been on a map or anybody's ever mentioned it, they have it, and they usually have the geo coordinates of where it is. So looking that up, I found out that the current name is Yuskapa. So Yuskapa, which is obviously an American Indian name, is locatable. And so by doing that, I was able to work my way through and with some other information that I already had. One piece of information that I had was that I knew that there was a person named William Tanner, who is most likely the father of Francis Tanner, was buried in a cemetery. And that cemetery was out in kind of away from the main part of Rhode Island. Well, Rhode Island is very small compared to places like Utah. So we think of it as very small. But he was buried in a cemetery that was off the third tee of the Laurel Lane Country Club. How do I know that? Is because Rhode Island Cemetery Commission had done a survey over the years of every cemetery in the state that they could possibly find. And they had them all numbered and all located. And so we found the William Tanner Cemetery. So we were on a trip back east, and we stopped off and stayed in Maryland, in Rhode Island for a short time, and went out and found the Laurel Lane Country Club. And yes, there was a cemetery out on the third tee. Fortunately, the person that was in the clubhouse took pity on us because we were old folks and loaned us a golf cart. So we got to ride our golf cart out to the third tee, force our way through an impenetrable wall of blackberry bushes, and get all sorts of cuts and scratches, and found the Tanner Cemetery. So it all started with the will, the map, and everything else. But once we had that information, the will that I discovered much later coincided because it's only less than about a half a mile between the river where the mill would be and the Laurel Lane Country Club. So we know that these people were all in this little small area of the country. So now we have some more information about Francis Tanner and at least the name of his parents, although we still haven't adequately identified who they are. Oh, and by the way, here's a picture of the cemetery. Those headstones had initials carved on them. And so the only way you could really even guess was you could see the initials of some of the people named who were named as relatives of William Tanner with a W Tanner, and E Tanner, E.T., for his wife Elizabeth. Okay, now we're going to skip to a different one. We're still here with Sidney Tanner, but this one I thought was interesting because I found a federal land patent where Sidney Tanner had obtained federal land from the General Land Office, and this land was located in Clay County, Missouri, back in 1838. And so we looked at that, and here's a blow up of it. And this is the description. And it happens to be under what's called the state land, the federal land system, which is the townships, range, provinces, sections, all of that stuff. And so this northwest quarter of the northeast quarter of the section 21 and township 56 to the range 29, etc. That is an actual place. That is a description. And interestingly enough, there is a program that's free, a little usable program online that will take that information and plot it on the map. And so I did that. Here's the map, and you fill it in, and that's the information that I filled in from Missouri and so forth. And there it is. It drew it on Google Earth. So you get a little file out of that EarthPoint program, and then you drag it down and load it into Google Earth, and it will then pop up with a map showing where that land was. And you can see the purple rectangle there was the original property. And it's interesting to look at this property because you'll see the eastern side of that property, or the right side of it, corresponds to the road, the north-south road. And all of the property lines line up. And that's because that was the original surveys, and anything that was left of that would have been, this is all resold and refarmed and everything. That's why there's kind of a patchwork out there. So interestingly, to find this, the exact property purchased, then we can put it on a larger map and we'll begin to see its relationship to St. Joseph and Kansas City. And this was back in the time when the early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were were attempting to settle in Missouri and were ultimately expelled from Missouri. And of course, Sidney, along with everyone else, lost his property in Missouri. Okay, now, well, we're going to carry through with Sidney, but an interesting example here is a newspaper. Always check the newspapers. There are millions and millions of pages of digital newspapers online, and there are huge programs that'll let you search through and look for information. One of those is the Library of Congress Chronicling America digital newspaper project with about 18 million pages. It's all free and you can search and do very specific searches. There's other big newspaper programs, some of which are free, and others, most of which are paywall, meaning you'd have to subscribe to them. But they're very helpful. And in this case, Sidney Tanner appeared in the Ogden Standard on 7 December 1895. And it was an obituary, a death notice. And it says, Fever, Utah, December 8th. Sidney Tanner died here last night, so we have the death date. At the ripe age of 86, which gives us a calculated birth date. He was a prominent man, having joined the Mormons in 1832 in New York, where he was born. Now we have a birthplace. He followed Joe Smith to Kirtland, and he arrived in Utah, went to California, back and forth. Okay, so this explains a lot of the history in a very short, little brief message here, and it may very well end up being resolving some of the issues and some of the questions. One of those was my great-grandfather, his son, Henry Martin Tanner, was born in California, and then his wife, who was born only a couple of years later, was born in Utah, in California, and they're in different places in California. Well, it turns out that the county boundaries changed between the two births out of the newspaper. Now here's a different one. This is Harold Morgan, who's my grandfather and lived in St. John's, Arizona. And I looked it up, and there's some significant things here, and it helps you to know some history. This is in 1918. What does that bring in? Probably today that would ring more bells than it would have before our current pandemic. But realizing that this is right in the middle of the flu, of the giant flu influenza epidemic that occurred, pandemic that occurred back in 1918, 1919. So here we have just one page of the St. John's Herald newspaper, and who else is on here besides Harold Morgan? Marinus Christensen, who's another one of my grandfathers. This is a great-grandfather. D.P. Overson, who's one of my uncles. O.E. Overson, who's another uncle. H.C. Overson, who's another one of my grandfathers. So this is all on the same page. And great, you say, oh, I found Harold Morgan in the St. John's Herald, Herald. And so he's all of a sudden, I'm through. Well, no, if I went through and read that whole thing, which I did, I read that whole page, very interesting. You read the newspaper, you'll find all these people and more. I probably have missed some that I'm related to that I didn't even know I was related to. For those of you who might know a little bit about early history in Utah and northern Arizona, you'll find also Jacob Hamlin listed right here. So in case you know, he's one of the early people who helped settle the southern part of down in Santa Clara in southern Utah around St. George, and then also into northern Arizona. What else? All sorts of information in there. Okay, so here's some things that were found in that one page. A boy was born to Mr. and Mrs. Albert Jarvis. Albert Jarvis, the Jarvises are my relatives. My great grandmother was a Jarvis. My great grandfather was Jarvis, and on and on. And so there's a birth record for one of my uncle's children, Lyman Overson, who was an uncle, has been very ill for the past week, so slowly recovering. Why was he ill? 1918. And there's going to be, as you read this in this time period, this newspaper, you find out that there were lots of people in that town. They noted all the people who were sick from the flu. So this is a very interesting correlation. And then there's one, Frank Christensen, who's another uncle, and he ends up being in the army and in the band, and he's over in Paris in 1918, obviously not fighting in the middle of the war of the trenches that was going on with World War I over there in Europe. And here's just kind of a reference for you. You can see that here's a 1918 newspaper from October, and in Wisconsin, and they're having 1,000 flu cases in Madison to close the schools and theaters. And, you know, history just keeps repeating itself. The more you know about the 1918 flu influenza epidemic, the more you see exact, almost absolutely the same thing happening back in 1918 that's happening today, even down to people refusing to wear masks and all sorts of things. It's very, very interesting. Okay, another kind of record that's very helpful, and we're going to kind of follow through here with Harold Morgan, and that is a draft registration card. Obviously, around that time period, you could look for a draft registration card. And here on the draft registration card, we have his age, which helps to confirm a birth date. We have his home address where he was living at the time, so we know we can look for more records in St. John's, and one of them obviously would be the newspaper there, if it's available, and those kinds of things. We have his birth date, which he gave, but we've seen previously that could be wrong, so we're always, as I mentioned earlier, there were 3 different birth dates for it given on one record. And we also see where he was born, so there's more places to look for records. We know his occupation, so there might be some information we could find. This says he was employed at a place called Cedro Arroyo in Apache County, Arizona. And that, unfortunately, is a place that so far has defied identification. I can't find it. The board on geographic names doesn't have it. Nobody seems to have it. We've tried translating it into English and looking that up. Could happen. Probably doesn't show any place where there would have been a school that he would have been teaching. also says that he has a wife and a child who's 2 years old, so we have more information to look for. And then we have a description here, which interestingly says, which I hadn't focused on, but he had a cataract over the pupil of his left eye at the age of 25. So probably when he was older, he had a significant loss of vision, at least in his left eye. So there's all this kind of information, plus all the places you might want to additionally look, even though he's living in St. John's. He's born in Utah, so you've got 2 different locations to look at. You've got all sorts of records suggested here: birth records, vital records, occupational records, more records for his wife and child we've got to identify, and following through. It probably did not serve in the Army from this. And we also have the exact date that this was done, so it gives us an idea. And we're left with the mystery of where is Cedro Arroyo. Okay, we're going to look this is where we're wrapping this up. We're going to look quickly at a death certificate. Now, the information on a death certificate is not necessarily primary information, and meaning obviously the dead person did not supply this information, someone else did. So we need to remember to be a little bit skeptical of what's here, but they are extremely good indications of places to look for. His name, obviously. Unfortunately, they didn't put his full name, but that's his name. Also, where he died and how he died, because he was killed in a truck train accident, hauling hay, and got hit by a train. And that shows up in the newspapers. So there's newspapers. World War I, he was a veteran, so we have perhaps some military records. He's married. He has a wife, but this is not my grandmother. And so we already have another instance where we need to look for a married person who is a second wife. We have a birth date, calculated birth date, and we have names of his parents and where they were born. So we have a lot of interesting information. So we can look in military records, census records, marriage records, newspapers, birth records, and the list goes on. So these are all the different kinds of places that are suggested by this one death certificate. So if we don't go in there and look at it and think about it and bring out all the information, then it gets to be. So what I'm encouraging you is to look at the big picture. Look at everything that's how does this all fit into my family? How have I related to these people? All the big picture items, and then don't ignore the details, the little things that are on each of these records that lead us into additional information and where we should go. Okay, well, thanks for watching today. Any questions out there? Anybody want to ask? And I'll be glad to be here. How are we doing?
I've got a quick question.
Okay.
Is there a specific corresponding lesson in the family history guide that covers similar to what you covered?
I don't think there's anything that specifically talks about getting more information out of the records. It'd probably be a nice thing to have in there, but okay. I know this is recorded, so we may be able to somehow get that information.
Okay, well done. I liked how you covered many different types of records, so thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, this is Bob Taylor on behalf of the Family History Guide. Actually, we do have some information. It's on the United States page, Goal A1, where it talks about records. And I think we have a link to one of James' blog posts about getting the most out of records. So that's a place that you might want to investigate.
Okay, well, I
tend to steal a lot from James because I really like what he does.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. I appreciate that. I posted it on my stake and ward websites and wanted to do a follow-up saying if you want to learn more about this, you know, watch out for the video coming up, or you can also go to the family history guide here and here. So anyway, okay. Thanks a lot for your help.
You're welcome. Anyone else out there?
This is Bob Ives. The video will be up in a couple of days, so if you want to refer to it, like Wendy mentioned, whatnot, it'll be up in a couple of days on the Granite Family History Center's website. And I think I put that in the chat, the web address.
Well, James, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for that presentation. Covered some great aspects of records and the kinds of things we can find in them. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.